Now we're going to study the fabulously interesting Genesis chapter 27 this week. And I want to get started by reading the entire chapter together. So open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 27. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 27, conveniently enough. Genesis chapter 27. In the course of time, after Isaac, that's Isaac, had grown old and his eyes dim so that he couldn't see, he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son." And he answered, "Here I am." He says, "Look, I'm old now. I don't know when I'll die. Therefore, please take your hunting gear, your quiver of arrows, and your bow. Go out into the country and get me some game. Make it tasty the way I like it and bring it to me to eat. Then I will bless you as firstborn before I die." Rivkah was listening to Isaac speak to his son Esau. So when Esau went out to the country to hunt for game and bring it back, she said to her son Jacob, "Listen, I heard your father saying, 'Esau, your brother, bring me game, make it tasty so I can eat it, then I'll give you my blessing in the presence of Adonai before my death.' Now pay attention to me, my son. Do what I tell you. Go to the flock, bring me back 2 choice kids. I will make it tasty for your father the way he likes it. You will bring it to your father to eat so that he will give his blessing to you before his death." Jacob answered Rivkah, his mother, "Look, Esau's hairy. I have smooth skin. Suppose my father touches me. He'll know I'm trying to trick him, and I'll bring a curse on myself, not a blessing." But his mother said, "Then let that curse be on me. Just listen to me. Go get me the kids." So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared them in the tasty way his father loved. And next Rivkah took Esau, her older son's best clothes, which she had with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And she put the skins of the goats on his hands, on the smooth parts of his neck. And then she gave the tasty food and the bread she prepared to her son, Yaakov. He went to his father and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" "Get up now, sit down, eat the game, then give me your blessing." And Isaac said to his son, "How did you find it so quickly, my son?" And he answered, "Adonai, your God, made it happen that way." And Isaac said to Jacob, "Come here close to me so that I can touch you, my son, and know whether you are in fact my son Esau or not." Jacob approached Isaac, his father, who touched him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are Esau's hands." However, he didn't detect him because his hands were hairy, like his brother Esau's hands, so he gave him his blessing. And he asked, "Are you really my son Esau?" And he answered, "I am." He said, "Bring it here to me, and I will eat my son's game so that I can give you my blessing." So he brought it up to him, and he ate it. He also brought him new wine, and he drank. And then his father Isaac said to him, "Come close now, kiss me, my son." He approached and kissed him. Yitzhak smelled his clothes. He blessed Yaakov with these words, "See, my son smells like a field which Adonai has blessed. So may God give you dew from heaven, the richness of the earth, and grain and wine in abundance. May peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. May you be Lord over your kinsmen. Let your mother's descendants bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you. Blessed be everyone who blesses you." But as soon as Isaac had finished giving his blessing to Jacob, when Jacob had barely left his father's presence, Esau, his brother, came in from hunting. Now he too had prepared a tasty meal and brought it to his father. And now he said to his father, "Let my father get up and eat from his son's game so that you can give me your blessing." And Isaac, his father, said to him, "Who are you?" And he answered, "I'm your son, your firstborn, Esau." Isaac began to tremble uncontrollably and said, "Then who was it that took game and brought it to me? I ate it all just before you came. I gave my blessing to him. That's the truth, and the blessing must stand." When Esau heard his father's words, he burst into a loud, bitter, sobbing, "Father, bless me too," he begged. And he replied, "Your brother came deceitfully and took away your blessing." And Esau said, "His name, Yaakov, really suits him because he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and here, now he's taken away my blessing." Then he asked, "Haven't you saved a blessing for me?" And Isaac answered Esau, "Look, I have made him your Lord. I have given him all of his kinsmen as servants. I have given him grain and wine to sustain him. What else is there that I can do for you, my son?" And Esau said to his father, "Have you only one blessing, father? Father, bless me too." And Esau wept aloud, and Isaac his father answered him, "Hear, your home will be of the richness of the earth and the dew of heaven from above. You will live by your sword. You will serve your brother. But when you break loose, you will shake his yoke off your neck." Esau hated his brother because of the blessing his father had given him. Esau said to himself, "The time for mourning my father will soon come. Then I'll kill my brother Jacob." But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rivkah. She sent for Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, "Here, your brother Esau has comforted himself over there by planning to kill you. Therefore, my son, listen to me. Get up, escape to Laban, my brother in Haran. Stay with him a little while until your brother's anger subsides. Your brother's anger will turn away from you. He'll forget what you did to him. Then I'll send and bring you back from there. Why should I lose both of you on the same day?" Rivkah said to Isaac, "I'm sick to death of Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like those who live here, my life won't be worth living." Good old parent. Permit me to quote a profound statement made by a great 19th century Jewish Christian scholar, perhaps the man whose readings have influenced me second only to the Torah itself, and that's Alfred Edersheim. He says this: "If there is any point on which we should anxiously be on our guard, it is that of tempting God. We do so tempt the Lord when listening to our own inclinations. We put once more to question that which he has already clearly settled. Where God has decided, never let us doubt nor lag behind." Wise words. How often we've all suffered from clearly seeing God's requirement for us, but asking him for another and different decision that better suits our personal desires or our view of what we think ought to be. This is what Isaac did, and it created nothing but trouble. This chapter opens with the old, blind, sickly Isaac, telling Esau to go hunt some meat as part of a commemorative meal that was part and parcel with the blessing that Isaac wanted to bestow upon Esau. This, of course, was in no wise what God had told Isaac through his wife Rebekah that had to occur. Had Isaac all those years ago simply decided to ignore what his wife had told him, that Jacob was to be considered the firstborn, even though physically he came out of the womb second, perhaps Isaac was skeptical of it? Had he formed such a bond with Esau that he could not bear the thought of taking this all-important firstborn blessing from this beloved son, knowing it would just humiliate and crush him? Or did he think that perhaps God would allow him to simply go his own way, rebel, and then bless it anyway? After all, isn't God a God of love and mercy? Surely God wouldn't want to make anybody feel bad about themselves, would he? I must readily admit that after several years of study, reading the wonderful works of some of the great Hebrew sages of old, my conclusions changed a little bit over time. It is interesting, is it not, that the matter of the birthright, that is, who would be the Bekor, the firstborn, is never really the issue in this narrative. Some of you may be scratching your head thinking, then what is this all about? Or better yet, my Bible seems to make it all about the birthright. Well, we're going to deal a little bit with that as we go, but I want to show you something that might ease your minds just a bit. Look back at verse 36 of Genesis 27. Verse 36. Because there it says, "Then Esau said, 'Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he's taken away my blessing.' And he said, 'Have you not reserved a blessing for me?' By the time we reach this chapter, the issue of the birthright has apparently already been resolved. It's not the issue anymore. Reluctantly, Isaac does seem to have accepted the finality of it at some point before this scene. And Esau was most aware that this is the case. My study of birthright and blessing shows that those two things aren't necessarily connected. The matter of birthright, for the most part, is automatically settled at the birth of the first boy child. Certainly, if that child should die, it muddies the waters. But invariably, the second boy child would automatically gain the right his deceased brother held. If the second boy child died, the third would gain the birthright, and so on and so forth. There would be no ceremony or ritual attached. None was needed. So well was this idea of succession thoroughly embedded in both law and tradition of that era. So the traditional blessings bestowed upon the family near the end of the family leader's life meant something else. In other words, it's not so much that at the end of the life of the current family leader that everybody waits breathlessly to see who will be the new family leader, who will be the designated Bekor, firstborn. I mean, we can just kind of all picture the greedy family members sitting in a circle staring in great anticipation at the lawyer as he gets ready to read the will of the deceased family patriarch, like children staring at the gifts under a Christmas tree, hoping but not at all certain what awaits them. We need to understand that the firstborn didn't get everything, just the largest portion. The Bible gives it the name the double portion. And along with that double portion, he gets the right of leadership over the clan. Now, what amounted to a double portion varied depending on the situation. Double doesn't necessarily mean the firstborn gets exactly double of all of his brothers. Doesn't necessarily mean that an exact inventory of wealth is done to make sure each got exactly their proper share. It probably did happen that way, particularly in later eras. More often, these portions were approximates. A double portion could have been anything from a little bit more than others to practically everything of value. It was just all up to good old dad. So what we're witnessing here is about the blessing, not some final decision about who is the Bekor, the firstborn. And the blessing in this case is about dividing up wealth. And just like for us today, and probably since time immemorial for everyone, the inheriting children generally feel that if one gets more than the others, that means one was more loved than the others. Or if one gets less than the others, it means he or she is valued less than the others. Excuse me. Now we're told in verse 1 that Isaac was very old when he decided to perform the blessing. He was nearly blind as well. Now, was he near death? Well, he probably thought so, though it didn't prove to be the case. He was 137 years old at this time. But stop and think for a second what that infers as to the age of Jacob and Esau. They were born, we are told, when Isaac was 60. So these boys were in their mid to late 70s. Well, that sure destroys these wonderful mental pictures we have of a couple of virile young men being led around by their silly mother, or an athletic Esau out there killing game at a moment's notice for this blessing. It also says that from the time of Esau selling his blessing to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew to now, probably something near 60 years had passed. Now, Rebekah, the mother of these twin boys, Rivka, overhears Isaac's instructions to the obviously delighted Esau, and she conspires to overturn Isaac's intentions. Now, Esau was continuing to prove his unfitness to carry on the divine line that God had begun with Abraham. Rebekah was likely thinking that if her dawdling old husband refused to carry out God's will, she would, doing whatever it took, even if it included deception. After all, doesn't the end, as ordained by God, justify whatever means it takes to achieve it? Wouldn't God rather have the goal of his plan accomplished, along with all the stuff that goes with it, even if wrong was done to make it happen? This must be one of the most difficult parts, I think, of a believer's walk with God, putting our full trust in him, that he will accomplish his will. Even if at the moment all of our intellect, all of our senses, our logic, our sense of fairness, our life experience tells us it can't happen within the circumstances at hand. So you know what? We're going to have to give it a little nudge. Rebekah tells Jacob what's happening in his father's tent. He joins with her plan. And that plan is for Jacob to impersonate Esau. Now, Jacob is a little bit reluctant, not because he thinks what they're doing might be wrong, but rather because they may be discovered and then he'll have to bear some consequences. Now, going so far as to put on Esau's clothing, even attaching goat skins to his arms and to his neck to imitate Esau's naturally hairy body, Jacob goes now into his father's tent. Skeptical at first, Isaac's senses tell him something's not quite right here. But Isaac is convinced enough that this is indeed Esau before him, so he pronounces the blessing upon Jacob. Now, the Hebrew word used here for blessing is berakah, and it is a very common Hebrew word that we find throughout the Old Testament. Let's read now the words of the berakah, the blessing that Isaac pronounced upon Jacob, all the while thinking he's blessing Esau. He says, "Now may God give you of the dew of heaven, and the fatness of the earth, and an abundance of grain and new wine. May peoples serve you, nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, blessed be those who bless you." That was verse 28. Now, without doubt, this blessing includes certain words, certain terms, that rightly confer blessing on the Bakor. For instance, be a master over your brothers. So while Yitzhak is not arguing over the technical aspect of who was designated as firstborn, he was using his prerogatives to decide exactly who was going to get what. And it more or less was his intention to give Esau much of what the Bakor should have traditionally received. Now, this is somewhat, I think, like after World War II. President Truman relieved General MacArthur of his command. General MacArthur didn't stop being a five-star general or a man of great power and position in the military. President Truman just made it so that MacArthur had nothing and no one to exercise any power over. Isaac isn't trying to say, "Oh, Jacob, you're not the firstborn. I've changed my mind." He's just trying to take all of the rights that usually go to the firstborn away from Jacob and give them to Esau. Just another way to skin a cat. Further, it seems that most times that the barakah, the blessing, is pronounced, it is more or less making official that which was by tradition long ago settled. For instance, a rich man sets up a will, signs a power of attorney that the will's never to be changed under any circumstances by anybody, including himself, and then inconveniently lives another 10 years. The matters have all been decided, written in stone, but how much each inheritor is to receive is predetermined. It's not changeable. But nothing takes effect until he finally dies, and then the will's read. This blessing, this barakah, is similar to the reading of a will, in that although things have long been decided. No actual transfer of wealth or authority has yet taken place. Well, the deed's done. Jacob has received the blessing that God intended for him. He held on to the birthright God told his mother he'd have, and he received authority, the power to lead the clan. But no doubt, Jacob felt none of that inner joy, sense of humility before God that should have been present after being anointed as the bearer of the divinely established line of covenant promise that was so important for the future of all mankind. For Jacob had done wrong in making sure he'd obtain it. His deception was sin against God. And his conscience probably dogged him for the rest of his life. You know, it's amazing. Jacob went through all of these contortions and he pulled off all of these hurtful deceptions only to receive that which never would have been denied him anyway. Because the Lord had already predetermined it. All Jacob had to do, all he could do, was to taint that which had been pure up to now. But now the other shoe drops. Esau arrives back from his successful hunt. He's preparing the meat, and he goes into his father's tent, ready, eager to receive his blessing, his inheritance. And a surprised Isaac knows immediately he's been duped. And although he feels for Esau, there's nothing that can be done for a blessing of this sort. Once it's given, it's irreversible for any reason. Esau is distraught. He begs for some type of blessing. Now let me remind you of the words of verse 36, where Esau speaks of two things that had been taken away from him. He says, I've had my birthright taken away from me. Now I've had my blessing taken away from me. Two different things. And he speaks of the firstborn birthright loss as a thing of the past. And the loss of the blessing meant for him as a thing that's happening now. Esau did not go into the tent expecting to be named the firstborn, the Bekor. Esau just wanted lots of wealth and power. He didn't want the hassles and the burdens associated with being the Bekor. He just wanted the material rewards that the Bekor was entitled to. Well, now Isaac blesses Esau. But he's limited in what he can offer Esau. The blessing Isaac gives him takes place in verses 39 and 40. Now the words in verse 39 have been under close scrutiny by various scholars for many years. And I'm asking you to pay very close attention to something that has led followers of Jehovah, Jewish and Christian, into trouble time and time again. It is that we attempt to resolve what seems like a contradiction in the Bible, and it winds up becoming a very dubious doctrine and tradition. And that doctrine and tradition will always lead us down a path that blinds us to the scriptural truth. Tradition renders verse 39. I want you to all look at your Bibles. Look at verse 39, Genesis 27. I want you to follow along with me. It says, your home will be the richness of the earth and the dew of heaven from above. Sometimes it'll say fatness instead of richness. Yet literally, in the original language, the verse reads, behold, away from the richness of the earth and away from the dew of heaven, that will be your home. What? How can that be? Why this obvious difference? Why would even the Hebrews read right over away, that away part, and then just rationalize it out of existence? Why would Gentile Christians follow suit and have it that way in our Bibles? There does not seem to be a clear-cut reason one can hang their hat on, and there certainly seems to be no conspiracy involved. The NASB changed decades ago to reflect this literal translation of away from. Alfred Edersheim stated over 100 years ago, well over a century ago, that this verse had been mistranslated when it showed Esau being destined to go to a fertile and lovely place complete with ample rain. There seems to be a long-standing effort to tie verse 28, showing that Isaac appears to be giving a very similar blessing to Jacob, also to Esau, at least as concerns about where they're each going to live. That is, it was supposedly a blessing that Isaac gave to Esau in an attempt to inject some fairness, to make up for the injustice done to Esau by his brother Jacob. But taking one look at the original Hebrew makes that purpose unlikely, as entirely different words are used to describe the nature of the blessing to Jacob and the nature of the blessing to Esau. In verse 28, the Hebrew shows God, through Isaac, actively giving richness of land to Jacob. In verse 39, it actively shows in Hebrew that Isaac is telling Esau he's going to be held away from any richness of land. And when one realizes where Edom is, the land of Esau, it's located at the south end of the Dead Sea. And it stretches, a short distance into the Arabian Peninsula, which at that time, and was all throughout Bible times, an arid and inhospitable land. Still is to this day. Puzzling why this verse was ever translated incorrectly, as showing that Esau was blessed that he'd go live in a lovely, fertile place. One begins to suspect that one time long ago there was some kind of sympathy for Esau and his plight, and indeed the ancient rabbis and scribes seem to have felt sorry for Esau to varying degrees. And when we can step back and think about this whole episode, I mean, can't we find some pretty good reason for compassion for Esau? I can. And after all, his destiny seems to have been set even before his birth. And Jacob was hardly up and up in this whole matter. Plus, it is certain that Esau's mother openly favored and sided with Jacob. So was it God's intention to curse Esau, or merely not to bless him with all the rights of the firstborn? See, these are the questions the ancient scribes and sages wrestled with. Well, Rashi, who's a highly regarded Hebrew sage who was greatly influential on modern Judaism, lived about the same time as the first Christian Crusades in the 11th century AD. And he had much to say about Esau. And in an obvious attempt to validate the earlier sages' sympathetic views on Esau, Rashi wrote that he saw Esau as a type. He equated Esau, currently in his day, to Italy and to Rome, and then Jacob to Israel and Jerusalem. That makes a lot of sense for his day and time, because the church was the Roman Catholic Church based in Rome, Italy, and the Catholic Church had for centuries been the primary persecutor of the Jewish people. During the First Crusade, which Rashi personally witnessed, thousands upon thousands of Jews were forcibly converted to Christianity by the Crusaders. Many more thousands were martyred just for being Jews. And thousands more put to the sword when the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Rashi went so far as to explain that the blessing we see in Genesis 27:39 that speaks of the fatness and richness of the land refers to the wonderfully rich volcanic soil of Italy and Rome. Further, that because it was well understood by all the sages that Esau was destined to become an enemy of Israel, that Esau represents the Roman Catholic Church. Or as he saw it in those days, simply the church. That was his view. Anyway, this traditional Hebrew view of Esau that shows both sympathy at his plight as well as acknowledgement of his destiny as an enemy to Israel shows up in an attempt to mush the words of verse 39 around to indicate that Esau at least received some favor from God through his father Isaac. History shows, however, a very different story. Recently, I've heard some speakers, read a few articles, attempting to rationalize away the rather obvious mistranslation of verse 39 by saying that fatness of the land is really just another way of saying oily. In other words, fat equates to oil. The idea here is to explain how it is that the Bible says that Esau, who would found a territory called Edom, was destined to live in a place of richness, which by definition will lead him to prosperity, when in fact, Edom has always been a desert wasteland where eking out a living is tough. So by changing the word fatness to oiliness, then voila, we see how the rich Arab sheikhs have come about because of their oil reserves. That fixes the whole problem. Wrong. No. Even if that horribly strained argument of changing fat to oil was workable, and it's not, which in the Hebrew language, the language this was written, it is not oil. The part of the Arabian Peninsula that was included in the territory of Edom has no oil. The southern part of Jordan is where most of Edom used to be, and Jordan practically has no oil at all. And south of Jordan, where the remainder of Edom is located, is nowhere near the Saudi Arabian oil fields. No, the term fat of the earth is just another standard, easily recognized Hebrew expression. It means the finest fruits and produce from the earth. That's what it means. In any case, when you correctly translate the first part of Esau's blessing, that Esau and his descendants will be held away from fertile lands, the final part of it and Esau's response makes a whole lot more sense. His blessing more resembled a curse. I mean, had Esau been happily blessed and thereby destined that he would reside in a wonderful place, living off the richness of the land, you think he'd been so determined to kill his twin brother Jacob? It's pretty hard to see. But being cursed that he would reside away from the fat of the land, cursed that he would live in a desolate place where it didn't rain very often, now one could see why he would burn with homicidal anger and envy towards that conniving brother of his. Well, this curse to be separated from the rich lands, combined with the blessings given to Jacob, served to set Esau, later to be called Edom, against Jacob, later to be called Israel, for all time. That is certainly what we see has played out in history. Well, even in the time of Yeshua, some 1,800 years after this blessing of Isaac upon his twin sons, the hated King Herod was himself a result of this curse upon Esau. Because at the time of Jesus, the name of the land of Edom was known in the Greek language as Idumea. And Edom was King Herod's people, heritage, and homeland. You see, that evil and bloodthirsty King Herod, the King Herod who sold out to Rome and became their puppet, he was a descendant of Esau. Now, the Bible shows how Esau mixed with the descendants of another group of people who would have had very good reason, at least in their minds, for hating Israel eternally. And that group of people that Esau mixed with was the descendants of Ishmael. That earlier tragic story in Genesis of a physically firstborn son of the greatest patriarch, Abraham, being rejected and denied the right to carry the mantle as the inheritor of the covenant promise. And we're going to discuss some of that mixing as we get into later chapters of Genesis. For now, just know that much, though by no means all, of the Arab world carries with them the genes of Esau. In particular, a large segment of the Turkish population is related to Esau, as are most Syrians and the Kurdish people of Iraq. We should at least have heard of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled the Middle East for many centuries, from about 1300 to just after World War I. The Ottomans were a dominant tribe in the nation of Turkey. And it was these particular Turks who are direct descendants of Esau. And of course, these Turks are Muslim. And we know from Bible prophecy that the Turks are going to play a primary role in the events of Revelation as enemies of Israel. It all comes together, doesn't it? The thing we must also understand is that the majority of Muslims in this world are in some way or another related to Esau, even the ones in Afghanistan. So this enmity that would occur between the twin brothers, Jacob and Esau, almost 4,000 years ago, has everything to do with the condition of our world as it is right now. It's what's led up to our current situation and how it's going to all play out leading up to and through the Great Tribulation. Now, looking at a little more of the blessing, or really, I think, curse, that Esau was given, it says, by your sword shall you live. In other words, violence, pillaging, that shall be Esau's way of gaining wealth and prosperity. And as I have explained on a number of occasions, these prophetic blessings have more effect on the person's future descendants than on the person who originally received the blessing. And that is what we find as we follow the progress of Esau's line. Esau's descendants didn't become shepherds. They became conquerors, bands of robbers who descended on caravans that passed through their lands. War was their way of life. War is even at the heart of what is now their religion, Islam. Further, the blessing also says, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restive, you shall break the yoke from your neck. It was King David who was the first descendant of Jacob to rule over the descendants of Esau, and as prophesied in the blessing of Isaac. Edom wore the yoke of Israeli domination on their neck from about 1000 BC until about 735 BC, a longer period of time than the United States has been a nation. It was King Ahaz of Judah who lost control of the Edomite nation, and not since then have the descendants of Esau admitted to being under the control of an Israelite. Hopefully this helps to explain the determination of the so-called Palestinians today to be free of any control under the thumb of the reborn nation of Israel, because many Palestinians recognize they are descendants of Esau. Now this chapter ends with Rebekah insisting that her son Jacob leave immediately to escape Esau's wrath. She told him he should go back up north to Mesopotamia, to her family, specifically to her brother Laban's home. She approached Isaac with this idea and convinced him that it was a prudent course of action, not by suggesting to Isaac that Esau might kill Jacob, but rather by appealing to Isaac's hatred of the pagan tribes that surrounded where they lived. Esau had sometime earlier married two Canaanite women, Hittites to be specific, and this tormented Isaac and Rivkah. Rivkah told Isaac they needed to send Jacob away lest he do the same thing. And he certainly, of course, agreed to that part of it. Now remember, though, that this is not a couple of parents sending their wide-eyed young child off to fend for himself. Jacob was in his 70s at this time. Okay, we're going to continue with our study of Genesis and begin chapter 28 next week.